So getting back to the New Testament, because I can get off track way too easy here. So one of the things that I had to contend with is I had to contend with the New Testament. Because up until that point in time, I had held to the view that we were no longer obligated to observe Torah. We were obligated to the Ten Commandments, with a slight alteration on the one about the Sabbath. I mean, after all, they did get the day wrong, right? And so, of course, being challenged by, this new Christian who was insisting that, we have to obey the law. That's what I read in Romans. So between this standing in the garden and hearing this voice speak to me, and then looking at this passage in Genesis, I now had a new set of glasses, not the ones that I'm wearing right now. Well, figuratively speaking, yes, but not the physical ones that I'm wearing right now. That I got a new set of glasses that now caused me all kinds of problems when I started reading the New Testament. Because now when I'm reading the New Testament, all of a sudden things that I had never seen before, and you have to understand, I don't think that I was your ordinary average run-of-the-mill Christian who memorized a few Bible verses and thought that that was enough. I read and reread and reread and reread and reread the Bible. And I wasn't one of those guys that could quote verbatim, verse for verse, but I knew where to find everything that I needed to find. And if it sounds like I'm being arrogant, I'm sorry. I just could. And the problem now that I had was that I began reading things in the New Testament that I had read dozens, if not hundreds of times before. No exaggeration. And all of a sudden I could see things that I couldn't see before. And it just put up these big question marks for me. Now, one of those things is, if we were to take a look at, for instance, Acts 21. Now, I'd read this out of the Jewish Publication Society version, but they don't do the New Testament. So for that, we're going to have to suffer with something horrible like the New International Version. And I'm only using it because that's what most Christians are familiar with and comfortable with. And if you can find, I mean, really, is there going to be that much difference between the different translations? The fact is that, if this is the most popular translation, then you need to see it in it. If I take you to another translation just to prove a point, well, then we get into a whole other set of arguments. As I said, I want to stick with the idea that your own New Testament, even in the most horrible of translations, will yield the same result. So anyway, Acts chapter 21, verse 17, and up to this, at this point, this is after Paul had done a few missionary journeys, long after the question about what to do with Gentiles had been done. Paul was now on his way to Jerusalem. Actually, he just arrives in Jerusalem in verse 17. And one of the first things that he wants to do when he arrives in Jerusalem to celebrate the Feast of Pentecost, or Feast of Weeks. I think the Hebrew is Shavuot. Anyway, that when he arrives for this festival, the very purpose of why he was going to Jerusalem was to observe the festival. And given that it was Pentecost, well, we would understand why. I mean, the church began at Pentecost, they spoke in other tongues, and so obviously they're coming here for a charismatic conference to discuss issues on the Pentecostal experience and on speaking in tongues. That makes sense to me. So let's begin at Acts 21:17, and it says, when we, and by the way, we is Luke who is writing this, and Luke, I think, picks up on the whole journey with Paul around chapter 17, if I remember correctly. So when we, Luke and Paul and all the other Gentiles who were with him, when we arrived at Jerusalem, the brothers received us warmly. The next day, Paul and the rest of us went to see James, and all the elders were present. Now understand this, James was the brother of J.C. James was the brother of J.C. This is not James the apostle who was called in the Gospels. This was James the brother of J.C., who was the head of the church pretty much from shortly after things got rolling. And there's no real explanation in the book of Acts as to how that came about, because from what we can see, James, the brother of J.C., really had nothing to do with J.C. during his whole ministry. If we read the Gospels, James really isn't in the picture at all. Yet here he is in Acts chapter 21, or actually we see it much earlier in Acts, where James is now basically the leader of this group. How did that happen? I'm not going to talk about that today. So, and so Paul goes to see James, the brother of J.C., and all the elders who were present. Paul greeted them and reported in detail what God had done among the Gentiles through his ministry. Interesting. It's what God had done through among the Gentiles through Paul's ministry. Paul's ministry was to non-Jews. And it seems that because that's what we read the most of in the book of Acts, that everybody seems to be quite comfortable with the idea that the only thing that was going on was what we read about in the book of Acts. The fact is that the book of Acts is this very, very narrow picture. This is what Paul was doing, and what about all the other apostles? They were off doing other things that didn't involve Gentiles. And we're going to be reading about that in just one second. And this following line is the line that floored me. Again, I have read this many, many times as a Christian and never saw this until that moment. When they, James and the elders, heard this, they praised God. Then they said to Paul, "You see, brother, how many thousands of Jews have believed, and all of them are zealous for the law." Huh?